which is it starts with an observation, which is, we brought up, it came up in several talks, how we can think about linguistic appropriation, broadly speaking, and the protection of minoritized languages and communities, while also addressing native speakerism. And this is underlying, definitely Lena's presentation and your presentation as well. And I think that much of what we've talked about speaks to the need for, getting sort of moving away from those essentialized constructs will ultimately help and support. But could you just say a little bit more, about when that topic comes up, how you address that in your own context?
Well, you're talking about so if you can clarify, there's the issue of appropriation that you raised. So about sort of not reproducing certain things. And what was the main part, if you will, if you could repeat it? I was a little bit unclear.
Yes, no, it was unclear.
Maybe.
Was thinking about, well, maybe I'll just use this term strategic essentialism, which is, something that we see being employed in when there is power relations that we have to push against in minoritized communities. And so this is something that there's, been a lot of theorizing around how we advocate, how we advocate in those spaces, while trying to not reproduce essentialism. So I think it is still the same sort of question, or both parts were related to each other, but I was just framing it in a different way. Yeah.
So by understanding, then I feel like you're observing that in many contexts, in many Native North American contexts, there's a lot of essentialism. And let's be very clear about that. And that there's quite a bit of gatekeeping that this occurs both within communities as well as from the outside communities. And there are different ideas out there about where this comes from. And it becomes very hard to tease apart things that or ideas that really are arguably core values from a particular community based on the particular lands that they come from versus other things that may be incidental, but that have been labeled in the same sort of way, perhaps due to colonial ideologies or as a way of asserting sovereignty and self-determination. We are this way. We would not be this, our Miami without speaking our language or something to that effect. Things that can be very powerful and yet also very exclusionary, and that often are. This is how I deal with it, and I deal very delicately. First, I think it's important in Native North American contexts to recognize that Native nations are just that, nations. Nations have self-determination. These nations have inherent sovereignty. That is not a debatable point. This is a basic truth. And so I put that out there. Native nations, as collectives with governance structures, have the prerogative to assert certain ideas. Those of us who are not members of those nations have a responsibility to accept those ideas for what they are. And so on the one hand, I do that, but at the same time, I also think about these R's and about relationships. I think one way to honor, seemingly very essentialist ideas without sort of reproducing the gatekeeping that usually comes with them is to put the focus on this, on relationality. And say, well, this is a basic idea that's out there, and maybe it's a very important idea, but now let's consider the particular relationships that members of that community and others have with that idea. And this then allows, I think, for quite a bit more diversity. Or if it is, in fact, the case that people feel that they have to be a particular way or want to be a particular way, then it also provides a guide for that. Well, what are the relationships with language users, for example, or with lands to do particular ceremonies, for example? What are the relationships that are needed to facilitate that outcome? So that's how I deal with it.
Thank you. Yes, that when you were bringing up this framework, I really felt that this is a really clear way to address that issue. All right, so then we have something in the Q&A now. Thank you so much for this presentation and also for framing your discussion in relation to settler colonialism. I wonder if you could perhaps share your thoughts about how you think about nativeness and speakerhood in relation to the issue of homeland.
Again, I do this in a very, very delicate way. And I mentioned in passing, it wasn't in the slide, but I did say it, that my tribe is the Miami tribe of Oklahoma, but that my Miami ancestors are actually from Indiana. And there was a period in between when they lived in Kansas. So this reflects two removals. The United States government calls them relocations, but we Miamis call them removals with a capital R. Two removals due to a series of treaties or treaty violations, actually. And so we're talking about a situation where my tribe, at least in terms of its political center, is in somebody else's homelands. There are Miami people in the original homelands, and I happen to have grown up in southwestern Ohio, which is near or almost in those original homelands. But it's a community in diaspora, and this is a reality for many Native communities due to forced removals or to individuals having to move to migrate for all sorts of reasons. So on the one hand, I recognize that indigenous languages emerge from particular lands. And indeed, when you look at the grammar of those languages, at the vocabulary, and at the cultural traditions of use, they make sense in relation to particular homelands. And so emphasizing that and facilitating relationships that people want to have, such as traveling to the homelands, having political access to lands that might be privately owned in contemporary landscapes. Those sorts of things I consider to be very, very important. But I tend not to impose some sort of a rule, if you will, that a true speaker would have to come from or be living in a particular place, because this simply doesn't work in my community or in many others. Right? So it's a matter of recognizing those places, valorizing those places, creating opportunities to have relationships with those places. But in the case of my community, also recognizing that Miami people live all over the place. I'm coming to you from Southern California, and that we can be Miami in those places. Of course, I do keep soil from the Miami homelands, the original Miami homelands, as well as the two removal sites next to me. So that's one way to stay connected while being physically somewhere else. It's right next to my desk.
Thank you. And as people are continuing to write, let me just check here. Wonderful. May you comment on some worries I've been reading, news or blogs, about non-Indigenous people learning Indigenous languages, i.e. in university classes? There seems to be a paradox, a willingness to revitalize languages, but a fear of teaching them outside their communities. A fear could be, what will they do with, quote, our language? What for?
I'm going to show this same slide again. I'm a person who teaches a class in which the students select and learn to speak a Native American language. I follow the public university model, which is that people can make their own choices, but I'll tell you that the very first assignment when they're making that selection is for the students to determine whether they need permission to learn and to use the language in question, and if so, they have to gain the permission. Of course, as a faculty member, I don't have the ultimate authority to stop somebody from doing something like that. But in general, people will sort of will engage with the concept, I think, in good ways. What is the fear of teaching these languages or using these languages outside of the context? My fear is that people will not be relationally accountable, that they will, following capital L linguistics, treat the language as an object, extract from that long logic, use the language in ways that bring profit to them, Or worst of all, and this is something that's happening a lot in academia, they will use somebody else's language as a way to become a member of that community and to falsely present themselves as a member of that community. These concerns are very, very real because they are very founded. These things happen a lot. Now, I will note that within my own community, there is a general willingness for non-Miami people to learn and to use Miamia. And in fact, there are quite a few people who do. Most of them are linked to tribal members. They, for example, are married to tribal members, or by extension, their children might be tribal members. And so they learn the language as a way of supporting their children. This happens all the time. But this is something that I think all of us, in this group today and beyond, need to engage with very, very critically. And I think, that ultimately, one of the solutions lies in relational accountability. Do people have the right relationships to use the language or to extract from the language, if you will? Are they exercising reciprocity? Are they being responsible? Are they reflecting on their own positionalities? Are they respectful to the original knowledge holders, from whom they might have learned the language? And crucially, keeping in mind that indigenous nations are sovereign with their own self-determination and have data sovereignty, are people who are learning the languages, particularly those who are not from the communities in question, respecting the rights of the rights holders, that would be the members of the community. So those are the kinds of questions I tend to pose. Most of the time things are okay, but there are a few really egregious cases out there.
Thank you so much. And as we're, again, sort of, giving people time and space to write, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the idea of nationhood. And so one thing that nationhood gives, or thinking about, nationhood, is we can separate it from sort of a particular ethnicity, right? So that is something that I know Gerald Baldwin has talked about. Like, this is a nation that is diverse in all the ways that nations are diverse, right? So, and you sort of spoke to that a little bit when you were talking also about people who are married into the community, for example, or into someone who's a member of the nation. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that, potentially, just the idea of nationhood, ethnicity, and these sort of like co-naturalizations that don't necessarily need to be co-naturalized.
These are very important issues in Native North America, particularly because the nationhood is often erased, right? That's part of colonization, is making people into special interest groups, if you will, almost like country clubs sometimes, who are based around cultural ideas and not around nations that have rights, that have treaties, and that in the case of the United States government, have a government-to-government relationship with that particular government. All of the treaty rights, for example, fall apart if our nationhood isn't recognized, right? Because they're anchored in that nationhood, in that political status. So I think it's hugely important to emphasize that. And this is one of the reasons I choose in most cases to describe myself as a citizen of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma, although I'm well aware, and we also heard about earlier today, the problems of the term citizen. Right? The key issue there is that when people are saying member, it doesn't necessarily capture that nationhood. And there also is a problem of people committing ethnic fraud and using vague terms. I'm part of the community. And they're trying to get other people to assume then that there's a particular political status that doesn't actually exist. But that nationhood is important. And in terms of sort of differentiating that from ethnicity, from various other things, might we bring it back to relationships? If we ask, what are the relationships in question, and what comes out of those relationships? And how is all of that important to things like theorizing language userhood, or choosing to become a language user, or having the right to become a language user. I'll note that nationhood itself is often framed, as something that just sort of exists on its own, but it's actually a relationship. It implies that the person is claiming to be a member of the nation, and the nation within its respective governance structures is also claiming the person back.